have a flash here saying that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris. The Princess of Wales is dead.
It's 25 years on from that tragic night, and I, like so many people, still have unanswered questions about the life and death of Princess Diana.
It's Diana. I'm in a meeting for another hour. All went very, very well at lunch, and I'll tell you when I've finished my meeting here. Anyway, lots of love. Bye.
She would say, I think they're going to kill me. I'm going to finish in an accident. Helicopter, plane, or car crash.
I found what sounded like a device. Well, there was definitely a transmission. No two ways about that.
I quite clearly thought that people that would come into my flat would not need authorization and worked for the government.
Yeah, covert. Nobody knew. My bosses knew, but none of my colleagues. Done this job and went home. And I've never spoken about doing it.
My investigation will search for the answers to the questions that have gripped the world for a quarter of a century.
All those years on, the key people are still lying.
Had her injury been identified earlier, she would have survived.
It was survivable.
In August 1997, the world mourned the loss of a global icon, Diana, the Princess of Wales. A decade after her death, an official British inquest concluded the car crash in which she died was caused by the grossly negligent driving of chauffeur Henri Paul and the group of paparazzi photographers who were following. But 25 years on, many questions around what happened and who is responsible still remain. I'm Mark Williams-Thomas, a former British detective turned journalist with over 30 years' experience investigating some of the biggest cases in the UK and worldwide. And now, I'll be using my skills to track down witnesses who have never spoken before and uncover new revelations about Diana's death before concluding what I believe happened to Diana on that fateful August night.
There's been countless alternative theories discussed since Diana died. And now, in my investigation, I'm going to focus on the key questions.
Was driver Henri Paul working for the Secret Service, and was he really under the influence of alcohol that night? What impact did Diana's explosive BBC interview have on the final years of her life? Was a British establishment involved in Diana's death? And could Diana have survived the crash? To start my investigation, I want to find out more about Diana and have tracked down the number of friends who knew her really well. Former fashion designer Roberto Deverick was a close friend of Diana's for over 15 years, right up until her death in 1997.
So what were your first impressions of Princess Diana?
Vulnerable. She had a melancholic look, but at the same time she was fun. I think she's a girl who, from the beginning of her life, she was an orphan of love. She had a very difficult relationship with her mother. She loved her father enormously. I think that when her father died, it was very difficult for her because she then felt again very lonely around the royal family.
The divorce between Princess Diana and Prince Charles in 1996 became a very public event, but Diana remained respectful to her former husband.
There was a very famous actress having lunch at home, and the actress had the bad taste to say to Diana, I don't understand, what did you see on him? Because these ears he has and that sad face. And she turned like that and she said, those ears and that sad face is the father of my children and the future King of England. I would ask you for more respect.
After her divorce, Diana continued her charity work, and despite revelations of relationships, they were always kept private. Then, in the final weeks of her life, she started seeing filmmaker Dodi Fayed. Photographed on board his yacht by the paparazzi, her relationship came under a global spotlight.
What did you know about her relationship with Dodi Fayed?
Diana was a trophy to show to his father that he was not such a dumb guy. And I said, what is this picture of you kissing Dodi? I said, Roberto, you're a Latin man. It's summer, let me have fun.
Diana had a wide and eclectic mix of friends, all playing an important role in her life. Simone Simmons was a close friend of Diana's in the 4 years before her death.
I've got wonderful memories of a very, very, very good friend. She was very sensitive. She could get stressed at times, the same as anybody else. She was a beautiful soul.
What was it that was so captivating about her?
Her extremely high intelligence, her empathy, her humanitarianism, and her ability to go out there and to take on the world and shine a light on the dark corners where people needed help.
Tell me about Prince Charles. What would she talk about in relation to him?
She was in love with him. She said to me that she never, ever, ever wanted a divorce. He had no idea about people's emotions. So when she had, you know, postnatal depression, and she was really down, she had nobody to talk to.
Right. You used to have marathon phone calls with Princess Diana, and in addition, she would leave voicemails on your answer phone.
Yes.
It'd be great to hear her voice.
Hello, it's Diana. I'm on my way to tennis for 1 hour. Got so much to tell you, but I think you might have gone ghost hopping in that house. But anyway, I have this thing switched back at 1. Whatever. I'll catch you later. Lots of love, Simone. Bye.
What do you think when you hear her voice?
Brings back lots of wonderful memories.
It's fascinating to listen to Diana's voice and how she interacted with her friends. Ken Wolf got to know Diana well in the 5 years he spent working as her personal police protection officer.
I remember driving back from Ludgrove, and she said, you can park the car, I need to go shopping. I said, no, we don't work like that, man. I said, what we'll do is we'll park outside the Israeli embassy, at which point Diana gets out and runs up Kensington Palace Gardens alone. And 20 minutes later, something like that, you know, she comes out of Tower Records. And I remember saying, look, this isn't going to work like this, because you're putting yourself in danger. And I said, that's why I'm here.
From spending time with people who knew Diana well, it's clear that she was very thoughtful, strong-minded, but also vulnerable. Graham Harding is a security expert who got to know Diana through the Duchess of York's Sarah Ferguson. In 1994, Diana asked him to visit Kensington Palace. He has never spoken publicly about this before.
I went to Kensington Palace and was met by her butler, Paul Burrell. She mentioned that she felt that people were listening to her phone calls.
When Diana asked you to come and do the sweep, that was because she felt that there was information that she was talking about privately in the palace that was making its way into the public domain in the media?
Yes. The newspapers, you know, she read it herself, I think, in the newspapers. In those days, a lot of the phones were analogue.
Yep.
If you understand an analogue signal, it was pretty easy to listen into. The equipment I used was in a briefcase, which you put on the floor. You'd have a wand that you'd move across the areas you were examining. You would have headphones on, and if you found something, it would go, you know, ooh, that type of sound.
Did you find a device?
Well, there was definitely a transmission. No two ways about that.
In an attempt to prevent her mobile phone calls being listened to, Diana asked Graham for his help.
I remember saying, I've got a great idea. Why don't you get a phone, you pay the bill, and I'll use your phone. So I bought a phone.
Did you do that once, or did you do that multiple times?
On the day I gave it to her, right up to, my phone was in the car when she sadly passed away.
Diana had genuine concerns about being listened to, but she had an even bigger fear, and one that she mentioned to a number of friends.
She always said, you know, Simone, I'm not going to make old bones. She knew that she was going to die young.
She always said to me, William would adapt himself if something happens, because she had the premonition she would be killed or die, or not in a natural way. I said, William would adapt himself to the systems. But I'm worried about Harry, because Harry is more susceptible to things, and he would suffer a lot if I leave this world. When you had a serious conversation with her about life, she would say, I think they're going to kill me. I'm going to finish in an accident, helicopter, plane, or car crash.
It's tragic to hear that in the years prior to Diana's death, she genuinely feared that she was going to be killed in a car accident. So were her premonitions a result of her paranoia, or were her fears justified? And who did she think wanted to kill her? The establishment? The royal family? I now need to go to Paris to investigate for myself what really happened the night Princess Diana died.
So you came over a little bit of a ghost squad.
Yeah, covert. Leaves you with a bit of a question as to, you know, why? Why so secret?
In August 1997, Diana began a relationship with Dodi Fayed, son of Ritz Hotel boss Mohammed Al Fayed. They returned to Paris on the 30th of August after holidaying together in the Mediterranean. They spent the afternoon at the Ritz Hotel and also at Dodi's nearby apartment before returning to the Ritz for dinner at around 9:50 p.m. Then left the hotel together to travel back to Dodi's apartment at 10 minutes past midnight, as seen by this CCTV footage which inadvertently captures some of the last moments of Diana's life.
So Dodi and Diana leave the back entrance of the Ritz, they come round the Place de la Concorde, and then they drive up to the Alma Tunnel, which is obviously where the accident happens. That is not the most direct route. From the back of the Ritz, you can see on my green pen here, that takes you up to Dodi's apartment, some distance away. Now, if I wanted to get back really quickly, I'd have gone that route. What we don't know is why did they not take the quickest and the most direct route? There may have been a reason for that. Most logically is that the route they took certainly allowed them to get bigger speeds than if they went up the Champs-Élysées, which was likely to be full of traffic. What is sad is how close it was to the Ritz. Within a matter of minutes of Dodi and Diana leaving the back of the Ritz, they've been involved in an accident and ultimately Diana dies.
I've arranged to meet a former police photographer, Matt Sprague. He has never spoken on camera before.
Matt, the reason I brought you to Paris is because I want to talk to you about your involvement in Princess Diana's investigation. You've not spoken about this to anybody, have you?
No.
And so tell me, how did you become involved in Princess Diana's story?
I was tasked, it was about a couple of months after the accident happened. I came over with a DI and a traffic sergeant with a replica of the car and with the intention of doing a scene of crime job, but covertly. So at the same time, at about 10 past midnight, when Diana and Dodi left from the bar entrance of the Ritz, I was in the back with a video camera, videoing the whole thing, and we went through the route various times at various different speeds.
So the traffic sergeant's in the car, driving. What did he think of it?
He didn't like the camber. As you go through the entrance to the Alma Tunnel, there's a camber on the road that throws the weight at the car.
Did you have any chats with the police investigators here?
Yeah, I went to the prosecutor's office. I looked through the paparazzi pictures that had been taken on the night.
So, Princess Diana sat behind the passenger seat. What do you see on the photographs?
She's in the footwell of the car,
right,
with her back towards the seat. So she's completely turned around in the car.
So she's she's turned completely and facing the back of...
Yeah, facing the back of the car, yeah.
Startled?
She was looking up into the cameras, but she didn't look that hurt. She didn't have that many marks on her that would have looked fatal.
And of course, those photographs have never been released into the public domain.
No.
My inquiries in France are paying off. I've managed to track down a witness to the car crash who has never spoken publicly before.
I was driving from the previous bridge,
right,
and I was following a green car, and this guy wasn't driving as fast as I wished him to. So I decided to overtake him at about the middle of the downslope.
Right.
And that's when I heard this tremendous crash. I remember seeing a white plastic tank flying across my windshield.
Okay.
And a lot of white smoke. A horn was, sounding really, really loud, and it was stuck, seemed to be stuck. I saw it was a big black car. I remember seeing a woman. She was slouched against the front seat. Her hand was raised.
And how serious did you think that accident was when you saw it?
Oh, very serious.
Right.
Very serious. Anyone dying in such a dramatic accident, it would touch you. But being Princess Diana, it touches you even more. That's why it stays with you.
So what about chauffeur Henri Paul? The British inquest described his driving on that night as being grossly negligent, and the police stated that he was under the influence of alcohol when he took to the wheel. Close friend Claude Garrick was with Henri Paul on the morning of the crash.
Pour moi, Henri était tout à fait normal ce jour-là. On a pu jouer au tennis. Ensuite, on a été prendre un verre dans un café vers le Palais Royal. Et ensuite, je l'ai ramené chez lui parce qu'il m'a dit qu'il travaillait l'après-midi. C'était un travail très stressant. La vie de directeur adjoint de la sécurité est compliquée.
And how did he manage that stress? Because the obvious suggestion is that he turned to drink. Alcohol was his release.
Non, je pense qu'Henri peut être... on peut le ranger dans la catégorie des bons vivants. Mais pas de, pas de façon de boire de façon excessive. Je suis sûr que ça n'est pas de la faute de mon ami. C'est quelqu'un de responsable, c'est un pilote, c'est quelqu'un, il ne va pas mettre la vie des gens en danger. Donc pour moi, il s'est passé quelque chose qu'on ne sait pas, mais Henri, à mon avis, n'est pour rien dans cette affaire-là.
Claude insists that his friend Henri Paul would not have driven dangerously that night. However, the car damage and injuries caused suggest otherwise. Dr. Frederick Meyer treated Princess Diana in the Mercedes and helped to keep her alive.
I approached the Tunnel de l'Alma and there was some smoke. And little by little I discovered that there was a big black car and the accident just happened, obviously. I stopped my car and I went out of my car and ran in direction of the wreckage to see what was going on inside the car. The horn was still going on, almost nobody around. So I take a look inside. There are 4 people. 2 on the left side were apparently dead, no reaction, no movement. 2 on the right side were alive, but severely injured. The young lady was on the floor. She was unconscious. She had her head down like that with difficulty of breathing. She needed medical assistance urgently. And I ran back to my car to get the only equipment I had, which was a respiratory bag. I came back and I sat down inside the Mercedes on the rear seat to give assistance to this young lady.
What was your assessment in terms of the seriousness of this accident?
The engine was almost cut in 2 parts because of the impact with the pillar. You cannot predict. Sometimes people are surviving very serious injuries and some other time they die within a few seconds.
As an investigator, it's always vital to go back to the scene of the crime to see it for myself.
I'm driving down the road now that's taking me to the Alma Tunnel, and as I drive down here, I'm trying to imagine Henri Paul driving this route. Why was he driving like he was? Now, I'm driving at 31 miles an hour, which is the speed limit, 50 kilometers per hour, and it's a very sensible speed. But we now know he was going twice that speed limit, which I would say is particularly unsafe. We also know that on the right-hand side here now is a slip road that's approaching. Now, if you keep an eye on the slip road here, you see that, but what you don't see is the Alma Tunnel. It slowly approaches as you come off on the left-hand side. They're travelling down here, there is a slight camber, and we can see now 13th pillar. That is where
the Mercedes collides, spins and hits the inside wall. And from that moment in time, that is the end of Princess Diana's life. I'm trying to set up an interview with the French police officer who was in charge of the investigation. In the meantime, I want to understand more about Diana's injuries, how they were caused, and just how significant they were. I'm travelling back to the UK to meet cardiothoracic surgeon Professor Tom Treasure, who prepared a report for the inquest into Diana's death.
She was taken from the car and she was conscious when they took her out. Her circulation was in trouble, fast pulse and low blood pressure, indicating internal bleeding. I think they knew that.
Right.
If there is internal bleeding, you need to transfuse, find the source, stop it, and deal with it. And the only place you can do that is in a hospital. She arrived without people knowing what the nature of the injuries were. And the resuscitation doctor called the only surgeon available to him. What he found was that there was a breach in the membrane surrounding the heart, quite a stout membrane, and that was torn, and the blood was coming from the depths.
What caused that heart to move to such a degree and have a tear?
What we know is that she was sitting sideways on her seat and not restrained by a belt in any way. When the car came to an abrupt halt, she came off the seat and into the back and was brought to a halt very suddenly. Now, the heart sitting here is only tethered by the big blood vessels at what we call the base of the heart. This part of the heart, the mass of the two ventricles, is quite heavy and swings like a pendulum, tearing the pericardium, and these veins are slack, but that one is the one that took the strain, tore not completely apart, just its front surface, and no more than about an injury of about a centimetre.
So had her injury been identified earlier, she would have survived?
It was survivable.
It's shocking to hear that from what Tom Treasure is telling me, if Diana had got the right treatment that night, she might have survived. As I continue my investigation, I also want to consider if there was an incident in Diana's life that set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to her death.
Martin ordered him to forge 2 bank statements, and they were used to get the interview with Princess Diana.
I'm investigative journalist Mark Williams-Thomas, and I'm continuing my investigation into the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, to establish if the crash in which she died really was a tragic accident or something more sinister. In 1999, the police investigation concluded that the crash was caused by chauffeur Henri Paul's negligent driving. However, I still have some unanswered questions. The police established that the Mercedes had collided with a vehicle just before the tunnel. Did this have an impact on the crash and ultimately Diana's death? And why was Henri Paul found with over £1,000 on him that night? I've managed to secure an interview with Martine Montel. So she is the police officer that led the investigation here in Paris in relation to Princess Diana's crash. Martine, thank you very much for agreeing to give me an interview. The Mercedes leaves the Ritz, no damage to it. It ends up in the Alma Tunnel, crashed, and you notice white contact paint on the Mercedes. What did you conclude from that?
Nous avons très rapidement la quasi-certitude qu'il y a eu un léger accrochage. Du fait de ces traces de peinture sur l'aile avant droite de la Mercedes et de ces petits débris de feu arrière de véhicule trouvés par terre. On saura après que c'est une Fiat Uno, mais la voiture arrive comme ça et vraisemblablement Henri Paul a été surpris par ce véhicule. Il l'a touché, il a donné le coup de volant, il a percuté un bord de trottoir qui était sur la gauche, là où il y a les piliers. Et à partir de là, il est parti en vrille jusqu'au 13e pilier. Il est clair, l'enquête le démontre très bien, que c'est la Mercedes qui touche la Fiat Uno et qui ensuite perd le contrôle du véhicule. C'est pas l'inverse.
So the Mercedes that Diana was travelling in collided with a Fiat Uno moments before the crash. The police identified a Fiat Uno, and despite a lack of admission from the owner, they were confident that they had identified the vehicle involved and so concluded this line of investigation. But what about the widespread public theories that driver Henri Paul's blood test results were inaccurate or switched?
Les prises de sang ont été faites immédiatement au moment de l'accident et également lors de l'autopsie. Et il se trouve que la prise de sang qui sera pratiquée sur lui donnera un taux d'alcoolémie de 1,74. Il est suivi par un médecin qui lui a prescrit des antidépresseurs. Or, les antidépresseurs et l'alcool ne font pas bon ménage. Est-ce que cela a eu une incidence également sur sa conduite? On ne peut pas totalement l'évacuer. Il n'était pas ivre, hein, c'est clair, mais il était imprégné.
Henri Paul's family have always maintained that he wasn't drunk that night. Whilst there was an analysis done of his blood to determine that he was over the drink-drive limit, you've never allowed independent checks to be done on that analysis. Why is that?
Non, attendez, c'est une enquête judiciaire qui se déroule sous l'autorité également d'un magistrat instructeur. Ils étaient 2 magistrats instructeurs. Tout a été fait dans la plus parfaite légalité et il a été établi donc que M. Paul était positif à l'alcool. C'est un fait établi dans l'enquête, point. Il n'y a rien à contester.
So what about the large amount of money that Henri Paul was carrying on the night of the crash? How do you deal with the conspiracy and the criticism that's been applied to the investigation? Suggestions that he had over £1,000 on him, which related to his relationship with the intelligence services.
Monsieur Paul était payé par le Ritz, mais en plus, il recevait de l'argent directement de Monsieur Al-Fayed, du service, un argent de la main à la main. C'était 4 à 5 fois son salaire officiel. Voilà. Donc, il avait de l'argent. Et ce n'était pas les services secrets. Tous ceux qui travaillent à la sécurité des grands hôtels ont ce type de relation.
In the years prior to Diana's accident, she'd talked to friends about being involved in a car crash and that there were outside elements that wanted to kill her.
Non, non. Ils n'ont jamais été portés à notre connaissance. Énormément de choses se sont dites. Beaucoup de choses étaient fausses.
So, I've just spoken with Martine. I'm on the Arc de Triomphe roundabout, but what's fascinating and come out of that interview was she was very clear that she had no information during the course of her investigation that Princess Diana had talked about being involved in an accident, and in particular a car accident. You know, she talked about it, and the reality is she was involved in an accident, a car accident, and that is how she died. After the French police completed their investigation, the Metropolitan Police in England launched their own inquiry into Diana's death. They commissioned 3 separate experts to examine every element of the crash and to see if the vehicle had been interfered with. This is a first time on television these experts have come together to discuss their findings. You come together as a team, but what individual skills are you bringing to it?
We had a team of experts working on this, and myself and Dave and Pete were taking different elements of that. The work that I was doing was in relation to the computer simulation of the incident sequence.
My role was more to do with interpreting the physical evidence. So I was more tasked with, here is what the French have gathered. So I was involved in looking at the time arcs, also looking at the speed from damage analysis.
So you break each part down in terms of what you look at?
I was tasked with examining the car and all the component parts, whether there was anything that could have caused the loss of control, something being attached to the car and affected the steering or braking, that type of thing. Because of all the tampering allegations, I wanted the Met Police to buy or borrow an identical car. I had both cars up on a vehicle lift at the same time. I was going from one to the other, checking out all the underside to look for any signs that anything had been attached to it, or any signs that there had been a small explosion to disable something.
And did you find any difference between the two vehicles?
No.
So your examination proved no tampering with the vehicle, nothing attached to the vehicle, the brakes were in working order, the tyres were in good working order.
Yeah.
So both the French and the British authorities concluded that Diana died as a result of the Mercedes striking the 13th pillar in the Alma Tunnel. And a contributing factor was the reckless driving of the chauffeur, Henri Paul. So can Diana's presence in Paris and ultimately her sudden death be attributed to any specific event in her life? 21 months before the crash, Princess Diana agreed to do a television interview with Martin Bashir from the BBC flagship current affairs programme Panorama. But this interview was to have serious consequences for the princess. Speaking publicly for the first time about her and Prince Charles's extramarital affairs, she lifted the lid on an intensely private royal life. Thanks, Tom. Brilliant. I look forward to seeing you. Bye. So that's Tom Mangold. He is an old-school BBC reporter from Panorama, and the reason I want to talk to him is I want to understand how significant the interview with Diana was. Hello, Tom.
Hi, how are you?
Great to meet you.
Come in.
Thank you. And you hear that Martin Bashir has secured an interview with Princess Diana. What was your reaction to that?
It was a huge coup. It was the scoop of the century.
So was Bashir acting alone in setting up the interview and using the tactics he did, or were BBC management fully aware?
This is terribly important in connection with the whole Martin Bashir scandal. His producer was the editor of the programme, Steve Hewlett. And Steve was totally responsible for what Martin did. The editor decided to take over the producer role. That's when the disaster began to happen.
But before the programme was broadcast, Tom went to see the then BBC Panorama editor Steve Hewlett to report some concerns.
A friend of mine on the programme, senior producer Mark Killick, came to me and said, our graphics artist Matt Wiesler has told me that Martin ordered him to forge 2 bank statements, and they were used to get the interview with Princess Diana. We thought the editor ought to know. So we went to see Steve for what we hoped would be a friendly chat and a heads up. And Steve immediately replied, "This is none of your fucking business."
The highly revealing interview with Princess Diana was broadcast on the 20th of November 1995. It immediately created worldwide headlines. However, just 5 months later, the same concerns that Tom Mangold had raised in the BBC were exposed in the media. Nick Fielding first broke the story. At the centre of Nick's investigation was Matt Wiesler, the graphic designer.
Bashir had asked Matt to mock up some documents, bank accounts, and they were showing a number of payments.
False bank statements had been created which showed 2 key payments, indicating that a former employee of Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, had been paid for selling stories to a national newspaper and for giving information to the intelligence services. Bashir then used these documents and others to gain the trust of Diana's brother.
Bashir, as we later found out, subsequently took those documents to Earl Spencer and showed them to him as evidence that his former bodyguard had been receiving money. In my view, these documents played a fundamental role in terms of allowing Bashir to obtain the interview.
Nick and his colleagues at the paper knew they had a major story. They believed it showed that the interview with Diana was obtained on the basis of forged documents, going to the heart of the journalistic integrity of the BBC.
Prior to publication, the BBC declined to give us any confirmation of anything about the story. The Director General was involved, and the Director of News was also involved in the story, Tony Hall, plus a whole number of other senior managers. This was a massive, massive issue for them. The BBC played a blinder in terms of the way in which they crushed the story.
So in 1996, BBC clearly failed to show transparency. Are they showing transparency now?
Not in my view.
I now need to speak directly to the man who created these false documents, graphic designer Matt Wiesler, to understand how and why he became involved and establish if anyone else at the BBC was aware of this deception.
When I then saw that in black and white, that I would be blacklisted from ever working for the BBC again, I think BBC management are liars and have lied, and it's right at the top.
I've learned that fake documentation was used by BBC Panorama reporter Martin Bashir to get an exclusive interview with Princess Diana in 1995. So how exactly did this deceit come about? And crucially, did the false documents influence Diana's decision to give an interview? An interview that certainly changed her life forever. I'm on my way to meet Matt Wiesler, the former graphic designer who created the fake documents. Thanks for agreeing to meet. What was your work at BBC Panorama? What documents did you make?
It was mainly bank statements, confidential records, all sorts of things that needed to be reconstructed. That was common practice at the time, to just produce a document, providing you knew that an actual original existed. I'd started my own production company, I'd just left the BBC, and I got a phone call from Martin saying that he had a really, really urgent job and he wanted to speak to me. First thing I asked Martin when he saw me, I said, why aren't your Panorama graphic designers doing this? And he said, I can't involve anyone, it's confidential.
What did he ask you specifically to do?
He asked me specifically to make up a couple of NatWest bank statements. It seemed to be like he was making up the details as he was going along. And I couldn't understand why the details weren't sort of just factual.
So he didn't tell you why he wanted you to make up those bank statements?
No, but he did act as if he was a secret agent and this was all, you know, very important.
So at what point do you have a concern in relation to the bank statements you've made up?
The day after, it was suggested to me that why not call up the BBC and speak to the producer, who I knew very well. I phoned up Mark Hillick, and I said, Mark, I did something for Martin the other day and I'm not sure if it's right. And he cut me off straight there and said, well, can you send that to me? He said, this isn't right. I don't know what he's doing.
After Matt's colleague went to Steve Hewlett, the then Panorama editor, Matt was summoned to see him.
I told him everything I knew, and it seemed to me as if Steve, A, didn't particularly want to hear what I was saying, B, he sort of knew everything that was going on anyway. He wasn't very polite.
When you watched the Diana interview,
I instantly knew.
You knew then?
I knew then.
Did you know before then?
Because Martin did say to me, on the night when I was making it, this is all about surveillance. Well, we all knew that Diana was paranoid about surveillance. It was really in the media at the time that Diana had these MI5 worries. No sooner had I seen the Diana interview, instantly sort of put two and two together and said, ah, the penny dropped.
Matt's suspicions were accurate. Unbeknownst to him, his fake bank statements had been shown by Bashir to Diana's brother Earl Spencer, helping to win his favour and an introduction to his sister. However, as Matt's concerns grew, his flat was broken into.
And I got home one day and someone had apparently been to my loo and not flushed. My reaction was, I was quite worried. I thought there was someone in the flat. I started looking around and I had made floppy disks for Martin Bashir's job, and those floppy disks were no longer in the floppy disk box.
And what was on those Martin disks? The bank statements?
The artwork, the bank statements.
Someone breaks into your apartment?
Yeah. I was terrified.
Who do you think had broken in?
I quite clearly thought that people that would come into my flat would not need authorization and worked for the government, MI5, whatever. I'd had word from people that the word was out there that I shouldn't be used by BBC producers and production teams. Tony Hall put out that decree that I would be blacklisted from ever working for the BBC again. And that made me angry.
So here we are, 25 years on, back in the news again. How do you feel about it all?
All those years on, the key people are still lying. In my book, they're still all a bunch of liars.
Speaking to Matt, I'm reminded of just how powerful and damaging Diana's BBC interview was to her. She was made to divorce and lost her title and security. But did she have regrets? Following Diana's meetings with Bashir, she spoke to friend Simone Simmons about her expectations for the interview.
So tell me about the conversations you had with Diana about what Martin Bashir had said to her prior to the interview.
Well, prior to the interview, he was talking about her. Did she realise, you know, she is surrounded by people who are betraying her? She said to me, I didn't know how many enemies I had. I saw the interview and I thought, oh my God. The next morning, I get a phone call. She said, did you watch television last night? I said, oh my God, you made such a brat out of yourself. I said, but what about the boys? I said, didn't it occur to you? She said, oh my God.
How significant do you think the Martin Bashir interview was? Do you think that set in the chain of events that ultimately led to her death?
Well, of course.
So what are the role of Martin Bashir and the BBC? Well, I've been communicating with Martin Bashir through a third party and he has provided me with a statement. I deeply regret the events of almost 27 years ago, for which I apologise then and continue to do so today. Though several issues remain contested, thorough investigations by both the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police have found that no criminal offences were committed during the events in question, now so many years ago. All those hurt at the time and since now need to have the opportunity to move on, having learned the lessons of the past and redeeming the time that remains in the future. Well, it's great to get some response from Martin Bashir, but I, and I'm sure many others, still have questions that remain unanswered. So what about the man who led 2 BBC investigations at the time into Bashir, the then Director of News and Current Affairs, Tony Hall, now Lord Hall? Did Lord Hall know that Martin Bashir had used fake documents in the process of getting the Diana interview? In June 2021, Hall appeared before a British Parliament committee.
We knew in December that he'd faked some documents. The difference between the inquiry in December...
How many documents being faked is acceptable to the BBC? I'm almost speechless at the idea that anyone at the BBC could be found to have faked documents and then them not face instant dismissal. That is absolutely crazed. It's completely against the ethos of the BBC. And your other response, though, was to effectively blackball the person who faked up the documents and then said that they had done so and come clean about it. Mr. Wiesler, where is the morality in any of this?
Well, when I look back at in hindsight, of course I regret the language that we used about Mr. Wiesler, and also I think we could have managed that better.
Following an official inquiry into the BBC's handling of Diana's interview in 2021, Diana's son, Prince William, spoke out.
It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia and isolation that I remember from those final years with her.
So what of the many theories about Princess Diana's death? Was Henri Paul working for the Secret Service? The lead police detective says it would have been normal practice for the Deputy Head of Security, Henri Paul, to meet with Secret Service officials. Are Henri Paul's blood samples reliable? I accept that they were not independently verified, but I have no evidence that they were interfered with. How significant was the BBC Bashir interview? Very. It led to her increased paranoia and fears and the removal of her royal security. And was the government involved in Diana's death? Experts have told me that the car had not been tampered with in any way. and there was no intelligence or suspicious communication with anyone in the car ahead of the crash. So no evidence exists whatsoever to support these theories. My investigation has allowed me to consider the death of one of the world's most admired women. Her life will be forever celebrated, but her death has been mired in controversy and conspiracy theories. I know that my investigation won't answer every question, but I feel we owe it to Diana and her family to finally bring closure to this, to put aside all the unevidenced allegations, the wild conspiracy theories, because I believe the ultimate truth, supported by compelling evidence, is that Princess Diana died as a result of a tragic accident.
Do